All right, peace and love, peace and love. This is Brother Garfield, and I actually just started the show without my earpiece. But hey, you know what, ladies and gentlemen, today we have a special guest, a gentleman that I had on last Black History Month. The brother is named Dr. Bruce Haynes. He has wrote one of the best books I've ever read in my life. The book is on the screen right now. It's called The Soul of Judaism. Jews of African descent in America. And I think with all the debates that I do and the arguments I have on Facebook, YouTube, social media, on Instagram, Twitter, people argue with me every day. And trust me, if you haven't read this book, you should not entertain this conversation. It's not for you because this book actually lays out the root of Jews of African descent in America. I would actually say in the Americas, because when you think about it, I'm going to expand on the doctor's information. When you think of it, you're talking about Suriname, Curacao, North America. You're talking about South America. You're talking about the Caribbean. So the Americas, I would expand and say, because actually this book gives so much information about the roots of why a lot of us actually have a Jewish background, all right, who are African. So, ladies and gentlemen, let me introduce my esteemed guest, Mr. Bruce Haynes. How are you today, my brother?
Wow, Brother Garfield, thank you so much for having me back on. It's really a pleasure to be here with you today.
Yes, sir. And periodically, I'm going to mention your book a lot. I'm going to tell you, Dr. Haynes, I'm telling you, I've heard the rapper Jada Kiss say top five dead or alive. Let me tell you something. Your book is top five dead or alive right now. I'm telling you. I'm not saying it because you're here, but I said it last year when you were on that if you don't purchase this man's book, don't unsubscribe from my channel right now. Don't watch it no more. I'm telling you, brother, I'm telling you, I debate Hebrew Israelites almost every single day. And let me tell you something, your book is like an eye opener for them. Anybody I recommend the book, they're like, oh, thank you, Brother Garfield, for mentioning that book. And I want to give you your flowers. Every time you come on, I'm gonna tell you the same thing over and over. I
Oh,
appreciate you, brother. You're a busy man and you're a very important man. And
thank you so much. It really means a lot to hear that. In writing the book, to be quite honest, there are two communities that I really were paying a lot of attention to, and that was the traditional Orthodox community and the Israelite community. And was I going to be able to be legitimate across these boundaries?
mhm.
And so far, I've held up so far.
I know the last time you on, you said someone had challenged you. I think on Facebook, there was a brother saying why you wrote this book or something to that effect. Can you talk about that?
Exactly.
A little bit? Talk about that a little bit.
Well, it's interesting, to be quite frank, I'm surprised that my book hasn't been better received in African American studies
Mm,
because it won an award in Africana studies in religion by the scholars who are there. And yet I have not received any invites to any Black programs or AFM programs or even
wow.
sociology programs. And so the folks who've paid an interest in this has been the mainstream Ashkenazi Jewish community. And that's sort of what's represented in the academy. If we go to Jewish studies at most universities, that's who you're going to see.
Right. I was rewatching the interview like 2 hours ago, and I think, I like to rewatch. Well, I don't really like to watch myself on YouTube. I love the information, so I'd rather listen to audio than watch myself. But
Mhm.
you said something that was important that I never thought about in all my 30 years of reading the Bible. All right, and studying even the Hebrew doctrine for the last probably 10 years. Hebrew
Well,
Israelite.
remind me what that is, because I have no clue what that might be.
I'm gonna tell you what it was. I was reading a page from your book, and we were talking about conversion or something to that effect. But we also talked about being accepted as a Jew because not being born from a Jewish mother. And I never thought about it that technically we're pretty much the Luso Africans were pretty much converts, because although they had sex with African women, and the African women weren't quote unquote Jewish. So technically they weren't Jewish also. And I'm using the term Jewish loosely because in the Hebrew Israelite community, like I say, oh, we're not Jews, we're Hebrew or Israelite. I'm talking cross the board race. I think we shouldn't even mention race when it comes to religion or color, because anybody could be any color and be a part of a religion. But what I never thought about all these years I'm arguing is that even the blacks who come over, technically they're actually converts of converts because of the manumission and so forth. But yet still in Suriname and in the Netherlands, they had different rules for, I think in Suriname, I don't know about the Netherlands, for when they're burying black people. And it was crazy. But the whole thing about the conversion, I want to stay there. I don't want to go to the burial. But the whole thing about having Jewish men having sex with black women still didn't make those children Jewish, just based on that alone.
In a technical sense, no.
Mm-hmm.
At least not until the 20th century.
Mm.
And this is where things get a little confusing, or where I say, maybe to be more accurate, the late 19th century, with the invention of Reform Judaism. Because now Reform Judaism recognizes patrilineal descent.
Okay.
And so you have this tension, I would say, and that tension exists even between the Orthodox and the Reform over those boundaries, right? So a Reform conversion will not get you into Israel under the law of return, for example.
Right. Wow. So, that's important, right? I didn't know that.
Yes. And so there's the boundaries are a little less clear once we move into the territory of patrilineal descent, because in a kind of traditional rabbinic Jewish sense, the only way to be Jewish is to have a Jewish mother or to go through a traditional formal conversion.
Right.
And so technically Reform Jews are not Jews, or at least many Reform Jews who trace their lineage to patrilineal descent are not technically Jews.
Right.
And so now that conversation crosses now into the race conversation.
Right.
And so, well, if we recognize patrilineal descent Jews, at least across one or two generations, how many generations removed do Israelites need to be in order to now not be considered Jewish?
Wow.
So this is where the boundaries are a little fuzzy. Like, for instance, in my family, my grandfather was born in 1880.
Right.
So technically, if I was in a Caribbean family and I had Jewish ancestry, I could be pretty close to that ancestry. In terms of only be 2 generations removed from it. Right. Other families might be 5 generations removed from it, depending on the family, trajectory.
Right.
So there's a lot of variation, even within thinking about, well, what does that mean if we're trying to trace, 150 years of Black family history? It's not even consistent across different families. Yeah. Right? Because one family has 3 generations, another has 6 generations. Right? And so thinking about that in terms of what does that mean for the passing down of that lineage, it gets into a gray area, I guess. And that's where the problem comes between those who really want to hold to tradition and say, no, they really need to have a formal conversion. And Israelites who feel that they have been living a Jewish life and are returning to something that they are laying claim to. Right. And those are very different sort of perspectives about what they're doing in some ways.
Right. What would you say as far as there's an issue now in the land right now. We're in the 60s. There's a gentleman, Ben Ami, Mr. Ben Carter, had moved back to Israel. For those who don't know Ben Ami, he claimed eventually that he was like the Messiah or so forth. They moved to Liberia. Started
Now
the
that's the original African Hebrew
Israelite.
Israelite,
Israelite.
right?
There you go. Right, the proper term. There you go. Thanks for that. And so they moved from to Liberia during the Black Power movement here in the 1960s. They're like, hey, we don't want to participate with none of that. We ain't got nothing to do with
Exactly.
that. We ain't no Black Power. We Israelites. We going to Liberia. They got a visa to go to Israel. They overstayed their visas. Then they kept fighting and saying, hey, we are the real Israelites of the Bible. They eventually, after years and years of fighting, they actually got some visas to actually stay permanently for the original set of people that were there. Now they're actually booting them out. Some of the descendants or whatever, saying that they or some of the people that come over now, they're pretty weary. Like if Garfield go to Israel now, they might actually take my DNA and say, hey, we're gonna track every movement you make, because they feel like African Americans are trying to come over there and stay and get visas and all that stuff. What do you think about them being actually literally being kicked out right now, as unfortunate as it is? What do you think about that whole situation?
You know, I haven't given it a lot of thought, to be quite frank. Um, it's been a political football for 30 years or more, right? And so, but this is also a unique Israeli government. This is not just any Israeli government. This is a particularly conservative leading Israeli government.
Right.
And so I wonder what the motivations are behind this, why they're doing this, why they're choosing to do it now.
Wow.
I guess so. So there are a lot of questions I ask rather than sort of making a judgment about what they're doing. It's more that it raises a lot of questions for me about why the timing, why are they doing this now, what's the motivation? Are they creating a nuisance in Israel, or are they creating disruption? Are there kids involved in crime? Is there a social problem that they're generating, or is it simply your time has run out and we decided it's time for you to go? Mm-hmm. So it's not really clear to me where that politic is being, the power of that politic is coming from. So, but clearly, anybody being deported from any country is not a good thing for those people who want to live there. And that's true here or Israel or any other nation.
Right.
So I'm always leery of nations deciding that it's time for you to be deported permanently. And often there are political reasons for doing so.
Right. So let me, I'm trying to get into some of the groups that you actually investigated while you were writing your book. And Ben Carter, aka what's his name? Ben Ami, was one of the guys who actually influenced a lot of people. He's out of Chicago right now, and he actually died a couple of years ago. But
so let me explain the methodology of my book, okay?
Right.
Because I think this is one of the things that was challenging.
Mm-hmm.
What I wanted to do was take all the information that everyone had written about Jews, Black Jews, Hebrew Israelites, and use my interviews and my research to then encapsulate all the other conversations to sort of write kind of, I wouldn't say the definitive text, but I wanted to sort of write a comprehensive text that I knew at the same time was only going to be a slice of the picture, because I can only interview 30 or 40 people. How many people am I actually talking to in the process of my formal interviews? Now, of course, I talked to a lot more people over the years, but my formal interviews, that's a limited number. So I don't make claims for every Israelite in the world, or even claim that I'm necessarily capturing the extent of the Israelite community. Mm-hmm. What I have done is I've read all of the secondary literature, for instance. I've tried to reconcile all of the past arguments coming from Bratz and earlier scholars, all the way through to Landing and other scholars who are in the contemporary conversation, and reconcile the histories they've written, the narratives they've placed, and juxtapose that with my interviews.
Right.
And synthesize it all into a coherent narrative. It's like, how do you make sense of this? Kind of, how do you make sense of all of these different people saying that, on the one hand, because in order to be in my sample, you had to self-identify as Jewish. On the other hand, the first thing they tell me, well, I'm Jewish, but let me tell you what that means. And next thing I'm learning about a whole history about Hebrew Israelites. Mm-hmm. And so part of the challenge was trying to understand, rather than coming at this question of, is this a group of black folks who've adopted Judaism and are they real Jews?
Right.
The question for me was, how is it that these people make a claim that they are Jewish and they're black at the same time?
Right.
Because the conversation taking place in the 1990s was that the romance between blacks and Jews was now over. The Civil Rights Alliance has come to an end. Farrakhan had put the kibosh on that. Right. And I'm thinking, but look, there are all of these black Jews running around. This doesn't make any sense to me. Right. And so I really wanted to enter into that conversation. Literally, I wade into this world of black-Jewish relations and the reality of these other people who are saying they're black and Jewish. And I'm saying, well, how do you reconcile this? Mm-hmm. And so my book was written in that vein. So I don't lay claim to say that I have exhausted the world of Hebrew Israelites. In fact, I think there's plenty of room. I know very little about Israelites in the South, for instance. I would love to learn more about folks in Atlanta, folks in Florida. There's a lot of this world that I've only cracked the surface, right? Quite literally. And so there are insiders, for instance, in the Israelite world that know so much more than I do.
Right. I think you referred to Landing's work. I think that work was actually a good starter to look at the history of the different groups from the 19th century coming forward. I was going to ask you earlier, what do you think about the Ethiopians? You write about this in your book about the Ethiopians and the Falashas and Faitlovich. What is your overall view of that situation? Because that situation seems to change a lot in scholarship, where people talk about they trace their roots back here to Menelik, they trace to this. And, what do you think about the whole Falasha Jews thing?
It's funny. I think once we go past the 19th century, most of it is guesswork. Mm-hmm. And so when I looked at the scholarship, that, for instance, many of the scholars concluded that the early Jews who were in Ethiopia probably were not real Jews. So a number of scholars who say that.
Right.
But when I looked at the history, and you learn that there's actually a Jewish presence there at the time when Ethiopia becomes a nation.
Right.
And then you say, well, how do you know that how do you distinguish who's real and who's not? How do you know they don't have descendants? How do you just reason away that possibility without any evidence? And so there was a lot of guesswork taking place, I felt, in the scholarship of reasoning away a black presence or a Jewish presence in Africa.
Wow.
Well, when I looked at it, I thought, well, it seems more likely that there was a small Jewish presence that maybe expanded under the conditions of Ethiopia adopting Christianity as the dominant religion. And then that created a group that was maybe at its core Jewish, but maybe became bigger as other folks identified. Because remember, people forget Judaism was a proselytizing religion in its first days. Mm-hmm. It was always drawing people who were non-Jews into the fold. So the notion, is only after Christianity came into being that Judaism that Judaism turned inward, so to speak.
Right. All right. Let's look at this for a second. When you think about the growth from different groups like a William Christian or a Crowdy or a Cherry, how do you look at them compared? And let me add Ford and Wentworth to it. How do you look at them? And
those are the people who I spoke to. Okay,
right.
I spoke to folks in Cherries. I spoke to Crowdies. I spoke to folks in the Ethiopian Hebrews, because those were some of the dominant groups. I also spoke with folks at Temple Bethel in Philadelphia.
Right.
And so And I also spoke with Rabbi Tate before he passed away out in Brooklyn. So I was trying to go broad, but capture, in many ways, some of the most visible people from where I sat on the East Coast at the time. I mean, these were the people when I searched on the internet, when I spoke to other people, these were the names that would come up. And so I ended up focusing on those groups. This is where I learned about the Cherries. The Cherries would tell you about the Crowdies. There was a certain kind of conversation that I stepped into that I didn't know existed. And to be quite frank, when I first stepped into it, I did have sort of classic kind of pejorative questions that sometimes came up that people corrected me very quickly. I said, well, how did you become Jewish? And I go, well, day one, I made mistakes.
Right.
Because this is how you learn. And people hopefully were kind enough to you to sort of school you before you made the mistake again, as opposed to just, ask you to leave. Right. And I was lucky to have enough people who would speak to me and explain to me what was going on. And hopefully I'd avoid that mistake the next time. And I began learning about how people understood their world. And that's what my job was to do as an ethnographer, was not to look at people's world and challenge it and critique it, but to make sense of it and to understand it. And that was the challenge for me. Why were people saying they were Israelites? Why were people saying they were connected to the ancient Hebrews? Why did they still talk about race in the next sentence?
Right.
It was the juxtaposition of these things that I really want to disentangle. And I ended up looking to actually Janice Fahrenheimer's work on rhetoric, where she really helped me ground what I was observing to what I was hearing. And that was the way in which we were using language to construct meaning, to construct a place where being Black was legitimate in a context of a highly racist context in the world. And I began to see that this was a pivotal thing that not just Israelites were doing, but that virtually everybody was doing, navigating the color line and deciding how they were going to fit into this conversation about race.
Right. I've been asking this question for 7 years, and I think we spoke about this off the air the last time that, have we observed anyone coming off the slave ships practicing Hebrewisms or anything, and who were slaves? And it's been a question that everybody's pissed off with me about. But what I'm realizing, even if we did find anyone practicing Judaism, technically they would possibly be a convert of a convert. So at the end of the day, it's such a difficult question to answer. And I want you to talk about Rabbi Fournier. I hope I pronounced his name properly. And he's speaking to you about the conversion in Brazil and what they're trying to convert a lot of people to Judaism. That's something that's actually in your book. Can you elaborate on that, if you recall exactly the conversation you had with
it's funny that I was in the very beginning of that project with Rabbi Fournier, and you'd really have to speak more to him about what his goals are there. Rabbi Fournier was a fascinating individual to me because he straddled both worlds, right? He converted to conservative Judaism so that his family would be recognized in mainstream Ashkenaz and Rabbinic Judaism.
Right.
And at the same time, he didn't give up his Israelite traditions. Mm-hmm. And so I see him as a bridge. Recently, I wrote about Hatsan Harishon in the foreword. And I raised the question about whether or not this was time for the Jewish community to take another look at the Hebrew Israelite community and whether or not there should be more dialogue between these two communities.
Right.
And I see Fournier, I see the Ethiopian Hebrew and the commandment keepers as potential bridges for that conversation if they chose to have it. And that's the other question. Do they want to have that conversation? And that's an open question. But I was pushing the rabbinic side of Judaism to think openly about the question.
Right. Okay. All right. So, what about Wentworth and Ford? Because I noticed there's a shift from Cherry and Crowdy and Christian to what Ford and Wentworth started to work on, as far as what type of shift did you see?
Let me go back I go back for a second to your slave question and
Right.
and Judaism versus Islam question.
Mhm.
Because at first I was very curious about that, and I did a lot of digging into the available records. And what came out was that there was a small Muslim presence, but actually even the Muslim presence was pretty small.
Mhm.
And this is in a West Africa that had been that had a very strong presence of Islam in the West African coast, right? And so,
Right.
so the Jewish presence, even if it was there, we know at least it wasn't a dominant presence relative to the Muslim presence.
Right.
And so when I learned that, well, there's only a handful of Muslims, and it wasn't as if they were able to practice because they don't have prayer shawls, they don't have any of the support that is required to continue in your tradition, right? And so there's outside of a few words, it doesn't seem to have had much influence on Afro-American slave culture.
Right.
We do have words like for the shouts that refer to songs of praise that do have Arabic connections, and so there are these interesting links, and you wonder where they come from. And history can be challenging to sort of connect the dots. Things become watered down and filtered, and so. But just looking at the Muslim presence, it seemed to me that the Jewish presence, if it was there, would be very small.
Right.
And was overwhelmed by all the other African religious practices that would have been here on the continent from the multiple communities that were here, and then the conversion of Afro-Americans to Christianity. And so what would have been left of that Judaism would have been pretty thin. That being said, Afro-American slave society identified with the Israelites in an overwhelming way that I think we underestimate today.
Mm-hmm.
That their identification with being delivered out of slavery by a Messiah, searching for the promised land, identifying with the faith of Daniel and other characters, the strength of Moses as a leader, all of these things were part of sort of the Black repertoire of religion. And we didn't really take the Anglican version of Christianity.
Mm-hmm.
And so that to me is the linchpin to help us understand why not just ancestry,
Right.
but Jewish story resonates with Black folks. The story of Exodus and return, of redemption, all of that is speaks to the Black experience.
Yeah, definitely does. I mean, when you think about they called what's her name, Harriet Tubman. They called her the Moses for what she was doing, and Nat Turner, then Mark VC, David Walker. You go through all the people who were revolting, and even to use the term Israel Hill, although that was the 19th century, to refer to them being the Israelites, on the land, although it was a integrated community, but its purpose was definitely there and used in form of an insurrection mode as far as against slavery. So definitely I could see that. Definitely.
And let me tell you, one of the things where I saw a fascinating connection, because I had mentioned earlier in my when I was with you before that I had a nanny who was Seventh-day Adventist, and I was sort of really raised as a young child in that tradition, right? So these are Sabbath worshipers, and they're focused on the Old Testament in a big way. Mm-hmm. So when I was 12 years old in Massachusetts, when I used to go visit her and her family, I used to do vacation Bible school. And so I had a rich understanding of kind of their view of Christianity. And when I started learning about Judaism, I was fascinated of the overlap between the way the Seventh day Adventists kind of were so Old Testament oriented and the ways in which Jews interpret Judaism in the Bible. And so there are fascinating overlaps that I never would have thought were there, because we've always framed these things as somehow there's Judaism over here and Christianity over here. And I didn't realize that the two don't exist without each other, or at least Christianity doesn't exist without Judaism.
Yep, definitely. Before we go any further, let me just put a cover, the cover of your book on the screen. It's this is Dr. Bruce D. Haynes, The Soul of Judaism, Jews of African Descent in America. I have to ask you a question, seeing that you have a sociology background, by the way.
Yes.
This is pretty much off topic a little bit. Well, it's actually on topic. Do you think, from a sociology perspective, we coming over on slave ships, different slave ships from different cultures, Senegambia, Senegal, Ghana, Igbo, Yoruba, Cameroon, Angola, over 40, 50 different tribes, and we basically come over and we're considered as Africans. Do you think, from a sociological perspective, that it's hard for us to get along, seeing that our background is from different areas? So, because you might have a tribe, an Igbo tribe here and an Akan tribe, and they never got along. So technically, why would they get along if they come over here? I don't know. I'm just saying.
I'm trying to remember the scholar's name. There's an Africana philosopher who's talked about this, and I haven't looked at his name in quite some time. Hopefully it will come to me. What is this person's name? Oh, I'm a little unprepared for your question, but it's a great question. But I guess the short answer is it's a dream.
Mm-hmm.
And these are imagined communities, right? Just like a nation is an imagined community. But you're right, when you have so many, thousands of different dialects and languages on the continent, the notion that somehow there's unity is a fictition of the West, ironically, as a consequence of colonialism. Because my sense is, prior to colonialism, the construction of Africa as a place was done with map making. And that was kind of a Western project. Right. And so there was a spatial imagination of the world and its political domain. And we carved it up with maps. And so I wonder whether or not the notion that we could somehow go back is a dream.
Yeah,
but at the same time, that doesn't mean Pan-Africanism isn't important, right? That in the same way that Europe provides unity amongst NATO, there still has to be a sense of continuity to protect regions and things like that. But going beyond that might be challenging.
Yeah, I think
just like we see with the euro in Europe.
It's like like, for example, in the place called Wida, which is one of the biggest ports, what's called Benin today, and you have people in Wida who is slave raiding people in like Alada, and Alada slave raiding people in the Oyo Kingdom who are Yoruba, and then you're now coming over, both of them coming over as slaves. Imagine them on the same slave ship. It's crazy, and they never got along. Like, oh, you took my people, I took your people. They probably can't even communicate properly. And now you're asking us to be African in America.
Here's a way to think about it, okay? When all the different Europeans were coming to America, they had the same problem here, right? We
Hmm.
have, right, Scotch and Italians and Russians, right? And some are Catholic and some are Protestant and some are Jews. So how do we unite them? Unfortunately, here we united them with Christianity and white nativism,
Mm.
right? So we turned them all into natives, we turned them all into whites, and we
Hmm.
create a kind of imagined new nation of white people. That's what whiteness is, precisely that. So, in a sense, one could think Garvey is a natural response to the politics that's taking place, right? He's saying,
Right.
wow, if this is the game, maybe we need to unite as well,
Right.
right? But it's done so at the national level. And this is what I think we see taking place all across the European globe, is using race as the basis for building your national identity. And we see that in places where there are no black people or Jews. We see conversations juxtaposing the natives against the blacks and the Jews.
Right. That's a very interesting point. All right. So, and by the way, ladies and gentlemen, if you do have a question for Dr. Haynes, you could put it in the chat and I'll read it out or put it on the screen and he'll respond accordingly. Now, as far as black Jewish relationships, as far as I don't know if I should even say that because if blacks are Jews, converted or not, how is that relationship right now in your eyes, as far as
Well,
black?
I think what's taking place now is actually quite interesting. There are groups beginning to organize themselves across racial boundaries, but as non white Jews. So many of them are calling themselves Jews of color. They may not have a self identity as a Jew of color. They might say, I'm a Sephardic Jew, or I'm this, or I'm that. But they're organizing collectively across these boundaries as Jews of color. And so we've seen a group called the Jews of Color Initiative come into being. They seem to be very well supported and resourced. They're handing out grants. They just conducted a survey of Jews of color that has been released, and it is right now the most comprehensive survey because it's really just the largest survey that's ever been done on Jews of color. Um, Now, it's not representative of the field of Jews of color any more than my study is, in a sense, because the sample that they have of 1,000 people are done through people meeting people. So it's a snowball sample. So it's not a statistically accurate sample. So we really don't know whether or not those 1,000 people are representative of the rest of the world of Jews of color. We just know that these 1,000 people who say they're Jews of color feel X, Y, and Z, and these are their characteristics. And so on the one hand, it's very informative and tells us a lot. On the other hand, it leaves a lot open that we don't know about Jews of color and how many and who they are. But what we do know is that in every single survey that's been done since the 1990s, the numbers of people who self-identify as Jewish and non-white has continually grown.
Wow.
And the black numbers actually have not grown quite as fast as the Asian and Latin numbers. And
Wow.
so the percentages look something like maybe 2% are actually black Jews, but maybe as much as 15% are Jews of color.
Mm, I
And
get you.
so this is why I'm saying this notion of crossing outside of the Asian, Latino, black. Now you can include Sephardic Jews, you can include Mizrahi Jews, and some may or may not identify as a person of color, depending on their experience in history and family, et cetera.
Wow.
And so this is what, for me, it's been fascinating, sort of the rise of this new, almost politicized identity of non-white Jews who are now becoming much more visible because they're collectively getting together.
Wow. Wow. You
So that
know,
to me is something interesting.
you said Asian as in Chinese, Japanese around that
Asian
region.
Americans,
Wow.
Asian Americans, Filipino, I know there are 22 different nationalities, I believe, if not more, that are classified under Asian American. So
Wow.
there's a lot of nations can check that box of being Asian, right? Sometimes we
Wow.
forget how many different cultural distinctions that might mean.
Is Judaism the new Christianity? A lot of people are converting now to Judaism. It's just the facts. When I look at the ISAAJ with Edith Bruder and Tadar Parfit, Derek Lang and the crew, it seems like Judaism is the new Christianity. It's like everybody wants to convert to Judaism. They talk about Islam being the fastest religion, rising religion in the 90s. I don't think it's the most rising religion anymore.
Well,
But
it's interesting. I think it's about visibility and expectation. So when they look at the numbers, when the Pew Research Center does their studies, the numbers of Jews and the number of religious Jews are still going down, right? Jews are more likely to be cultural identified as opposed to religiously identified. And so the strength of religion is still kind of on the decline. With that being said, people who convert, I think, tend to move towards the more traditional and ritualistic side of religion. And so that's a set of contradictions for sure. And it could be that given the outmarriage rates of the traditional American Jewish community, that this is going to be one strategy for survival for the Jewish community of maintaining itself, is that conversion might be a viable way of maintaining the numbers.
Right. You looked at you didn't look too much into the one. Did you do any interviews with the One West camps? Did you do any interviews at all with them?
No, I don't know that group actually.
Okay, the One West camps, they believe in the Torah and the New Testament. So they're saying right. So they
any group that, it's funny. Jesus was my boundary. I had to decide where the boundary was for Israelites and Messianic Jews. Right. So Jesus became the boundary. And here's how I came to that conclusion. Okay, Gary Tobin at the Center the Center for Jewish and Communal Research in San Francisco. He was having these think tanks, inviting Jews from all over the world, Ugandan, Ethiopian Jews, folks from different branches of the Israelite community, along with people like Robin Washington and other Ashkenazi Jews, and bringing them all together for a big conversation. And Tobin's attitude was about a big tent, and this is why he wanted to provide programming and organization for non-traditional Jews, and this was including lesbian Jews as well. But the conversation was mostly about race and Jews of color. That was 90% of the conversation. Right. And so what was fascinating for me was race was sort of a conversation, but it was mostly about, we are people who have a problem with the mainstream Ashkenazi community because we feel like outsiders, or we experience discrimination, or we experience racism, or blah, blah, blah. The irony was that, so the discussion wasn't really debating about race at all. Race was almost like they all agreed upon. Where they debated was come a Friday night and people were talking about, well, what kind of service are we going to hold? That's when, the crap hit the fan, so to speak, because you have people who are leaning towards orthodoxy, who say, hey, we want separate seating. We can't have women reading from the Torah. We have other people who are progressive Jews who say, of course, women read from the Torah. How could it be any other way? And so they're having, almost a classic debate about what does it mean to be a Jew. Race ends up irrelevant. And that to me was the biggest lesson I learned, being amongst all of a conversation where you brought all of the different traditions together. They couldn't agree on tradition any more than bringing Jews from different traditions together and trying to get them to agree.
Right.
The two Jews, three opinions. It was no different.
Were the we got a question from a brother by the name of Hebrew Israelism. Were the Hebrew Israelites back in the day more receptive to building bridges with European Jews than the Hebrew Israelites are today, or less, in your opinion?
First, let me say that's a great question, I think. A really wonderful question. Judging from the material I've been reading, I saw a fascinating trajectory from the early days with Wentworth Matthews, for example, when they were really saying, white Jews are imposters. And some of their rhetoric did not sound too different from Ben Ami.
Mm-hmm.
But by the 70s, Matthews and Rabbi Paris and others were having this rich dialogue through Hatson Harashon, but it fell apart in a few years, right?
Right.
Still, in 1981, I believe the date is, the Ethiopian Hebrews created a resolution. I believe it is 801A, if I'm not mistaken, if my memory serves me correct. And it was a fascinating statement where they say Judaism is non-racial and has nothing to do with race, and we recognize our Ashkenaz brothers. That was a fascinating break from Matthews. Now, people don't talk about transformation and change. But for me, I certainly watched the trajectory of people moving more towards what I would call rabbinic Judaism.
Right.
Now, the question still remains, what does that mean with regards to dialogue with Ashkenazi Jews, which is a related but somewhat separate question.
Right.
So, for instance, so many of the Ethiopian Hebrews continue to send their kids to yeshivas, even after things broke off with Hassan Harashon and Ashkenazi Jews.
Right.
So for them, they valued the learning. That didn't mean they wanted to go into this other conversation. See, so there's really, I started seeing a difference between those groups who were moving towards rabbinic tradition, and then what did that mean for their relationship with their Ashkenazi brethren? And different groups have taken different positions on that.
In your studies, in researching your book, did you notice any form of Messianic Judaism in Europe or with the slave masters or with anybody that came over here? Have you observed Messianic Judaism?
Messianic Judaism is interesting. I never studied it, but it seems to kind of probably emerge out of the same time period that some of the early Black Jewish and Israelite groups emerge. And a lot of this is taking place in cities like New York and Chicago, because I think they're very dynamic places. People from all over the globe and the African diaspora are meeting each other, and they're sharing ideas, and they're intermarrying, and so it becomes a very dynamic place for ideas about politics and culture. And so it's not surprising, for example, Harlem produces both, folks from the Nation of Islam as well as folks from Israelite communities, right? And all of this was taking place right next to Father Divine, right? So
Right. Exactly.
this is all this richness of exchange that I think we underestimate that takes place in the sort of Black religious context. And I think that's something that's different itself from the mainstream European religion. That the notion of fluidity seems much more acceptable in an African context. That, you have a cousin who's Muslim and a sister who's Christian, and that's all okay.
Right.
Whereas here, sort of everybody's supposed to be one thing. And so we don't have a fluid notion of religion and prayer.
I was going to ask this question, but this gentleman just made a comment. What does Jews actually mean? Meaning, I was going to ask you, do you look at Jew meaning the same thing as it would mean to like somebody like Wentworth in the 1920s? Do you think
Okay, so here's the problem. When I first started to do this work, the first thing I said, all right, Jews, who are Jews? I'm going to look in the history books and trace Jews back in time.
Right.
Guess what happens when you do that? The terms are non-transferable. Different nations have different terms for Jews. The term Jew emerges in the 19th and 20th century as a replacement for Hebrew, which actually was much more common amongst mainstream European Jews in the 19th century. They
Mm,
gave up Hebrew because it signified a race.
okay.
Yeah. And so, the notion that somehow European Jews are not the same as Hebrews is a misnomer because 19th century European Jews call themselves Hebrews.
Good point. Good point. Good point.
Okay? The term Jew emerges mostly in the 20th century as the notion of pluralism and the notion that, because people forget this, a big part of this. This is really important, I think. The whole notion of a Jewish question in Europe. What did that mean? The question was, could Jews become assimilable into European nations? Same question that the Germans were raising, right? And so at the turn of the 19th century, in the 18th century, people said Jews were a race. In the 19th century, scholars were raising, well, are Jews a race or are they not? Are they part of this white family we're constructing? This Caucasian European family, or are Jews alien? And so a whole field of ethnology emerges. There were a number of books written at the turn of the century on sort of the racial heritage of Jews. Are they white or not? And so the conversations merge with scientific racism, with eugenics, and when you look at it historically, there's kind of a crossroads being driven by colonialism. There's a color line being driven, right, at the end of the 19th century. And if you're on the racial other side of the coin, guess what happens to you? Like Chinese folks and Mexican folks and black folks, you get run out of town.
Right.
So Jews have a choice. They can be on the other side of the other coin, or they can say, no, we're part of the white family.
Mm,
Right? So the notion of Jews as Semites, which is a linguistic term, is floated around. That's one of the ways people say, well, Jews are really Semites, and that makes them different and unique. And the construction of them as part of this sort of emerging, what some scholars call a Herrenvolk society, but basically a community of white folks as the national identity in America. The question is, are Jews going to be in that identity or out of that identity? They use the notion of pluralism and ethnicity to claim to be in. They say, no, we can be Jewish and American at the same time. So you can be Jewish and American, the hyphenated thing. That framing of ethnicity is making a sort of claim to whiteness, so to speak.
wow.
And it does have a cost for black folks in the sense that it helps to reinforce the color line.
Mm,
But also put yourself in the place of Jews. You have one choice, be on which side of the color line you want to be on. Right? People forget that the reason that liberal Jews were supporting Du Bois in 1908 was because the riots that were taking place all across the nation for a decade, not just for a couple of years, but these race riots that have been taking place, burning black people out, were coming north, and they came to Springfield, Illinois. And liberal Jews up there got nervous, so they got some liberal lawyers together, like Springarm, and the next thing you know, they said, hey, Mr. Du Bois, we'd like to support an organization for you guys. Well, it was in part Jewish fear that this racism thing was going to catch fire and they'd be next on the chopping block. So rethinking, because remember, only 30 years later, we get Nazi Germany and Jews are in ovens.
yep.
And the parallel between the US and eugenics and Nazi Germany at the turn of the century are very close. We're in lockstep with the Germans. So thinking about it in that context, Jews were provisionally white and really didn't become comfortably white until after World War II,
Right.
into the 60s and 70s. And now we see violence of Jews in synagogues. So I say comfortably white, but for how long?
Okay.
So, and this is where, for me, the racial history about Jews and the history of who Jewish people are is mixed up with the racialization of black folks. See, those two historical conversations are in tandem.
Yeah, in your book, you talked about, I think, 1479. There was a record of the first black or African person being converted to the religion. Do you remember that statement in the book?
Ooh.
14. I could find it if I
This is
want.
probably some records. I'm probably making reference to Jewish communities in the Netherlands where they're being accused of converting Jews, converting Black Africans. Yeah,
Hmm.
yep.
Okay.
That was
Um,
part of the records of the Portuguese and Spanish Inquisition.
Inquisition, right? Do you find because you never dealt with the One West group, so it's kind of they actually branched off from Commandment Keepers. So the Commandment Keepers, you had Abba Bivens, and then you had the Seven Heads with Arya and them, and they started their own movement. So the guys on the street corners, those are pretty much them. The GMS, the Lions of Israel, the ISUPK, the IUIC in purple, and all that stuff. So they're like an offshoot, but they're messianic. So those guys now are claiming they're claiming the same thing Wentworth is claiming, that the Jews were original black, and everybody's black, of course, and that the Jews are there, the fake Jews, and so forth. But the thing is, I just don't find it goes back to this whole messianic stuff. You just said that you didn't see it until it's something that my brother in the audience, Truth Historian, calls made in America. So we wouldn't see it anywhere else. So
Precisely.
how could we descend from Jews from like the fourth century or the fifth century AD, or when they're not practicing this religion that they're practicing today? It kind of, I don't really want to ask you a religious question, but it kind of muddles the water. You're trying to claim you're somebody, but the people you're claiming didn't believe what you believe. What do you think about that?
But there's a fascinating conversation when we talk about ancestry and identity because why should I be what my grandfather was?
Mm,
I'm just saying, what is the logic?
right.
And it's almost it's something it's stories we make up about our past, and we treat these stories as facts. But even sort of the notion of Jews as being all descended from Abraham is kind of a fiction, right? Not everybody clearly is descended because some people converted. But after one's converted, eventually one's family will be permitted to be included within that narrative of you or two are part of that lineage. So, but religion is about belief. And this is where the distinction between the social scientists looking at this and saying, well, this is how people construct their beliefs and make meaning. And whereas for these people, this is how they live their lives. Right? So their perspective is, no, this is truth. This is real.
Mm-hmm.
My social science perspective says, no, kind of all the religions are kind of making it up as they go along.
Right.
in other words, the Israelites are no less fictitious about their claims as rabbinic Jews are about their claims. I'm saying they're all kind of creating fictions and drawing boundaries.
Right, right, right. I see what you're saying. So you're saying instead of going backwards and using them as a yardstick and measure, for lack of a better term, you
Exactly.
you possibly could create your own thing. Which I think they actually Abba Bivens was a smart guy because he created something called a 12 tribes chart, where he said that the tribes are in the Caribbean and in North America. North America would be the tribe of Judah. In Haiti would be the tribe of Levi. In Jamaica they would be Benjamin. So he created this whole chart to basically say we are the descendants of the ancient Israelites, and all the 12 tribes are here in this part of the world, basing it mainly off Deuteronomy 28, verses 68, which is a very important scripture talking about ships coming off ships. So that Egypt is not there, Egypt is really America, and all that good stuff. So that was developed under Abba Bivens and the ISUPK, and it's resonating because they're using these scriptures to recruit people and say, hey, we have the truth, you know.
But, isn't that what Islam does? right? When we talk about, militant Islamic groups that are interpreting this means jihad, we're taking this, and other Muslims say, no, that's not what the text means. The text does not mean you should
Should kill,
interpretation, right?
right? Infidels,
So
kill the infidel.
sometimes
Mhm.
these texts allow us to read there's a lot of leeway that we can use in reading, interpreting these texts. And to the point where I'm not sure the human brain is almost so creative that we can flip things inside out. So
Mhm.
just like back in the 19th century, we said, no black man was intelligent enough to go toe to toe with a white man in a boxing ring because
Mhm.
we're too intellectually feeble. And
Jack Jackson.
when we win those fights, then we say, well, maybe we have extra tendons or something special. We're extra strong. Something gave us an advantage.
Steroid. Yep. Mhm.
Okay, and so that's what I mean by malleable.
Mhm. Let me ask you this: what project are you working on? What's your next project?
Well, it's interesting. It's been a fascinating ride for me because I've been doing a lot of talks. I've been giving a lot of talks to Ashkenazi communities that are very much interested in civil rights dialogue, in rekindling dialogue with the Black community, in issues of social justice, in questions about Mr. Floyd, in questions about their own identity as Jews or as white people. Like all of these things have been kicked up in the past year or two. And I think these are really healthy conversations that are taking place. So I've been really happy to be a part of them. But that's taken me away from doing any empirical research. But I have been writing some essays drawing on some of the work I've already done, but also on some of the insights of people like Tudor Parfit. I like his new book on
The hybrid hate.
linking
Hybrid
exactly
hate.
hybrid hate, linking this history and looking at this history, and I think more can be done with that conversation and unraveling the way in which um, ideas about race have been built upon Jews and blacks, and how they are kind of in a certain conversation that I think is manifested in Germany, for example, when there's actually almost a conflation of Jews into black caricatures when they talk about Jews involved with the jazz world of the 30s. And so I'm still I'm writing on that topic, kind of looking and wondering whether or not the term anti-Semitism is works as an analytical term to understand the attitudes that have been constructed towards Jews. Because
Mm.
anti-Semitism is sort of just reduced to Jewish hatred, but there's a lot built into that Jewish hatred. Narratives about Jews as the devil, narratives about the Jewish body, narratives about Jews as controlling and conspiracies and all these. So there's a layering of conversation that involves race when it comes to looking at the history of how Jews have been constructed.
Right.
And
What do
it's
you
that
say?
dynamic I'm fascinated with.
What do you say to someone who wants to be a Jew? You're talking to Garfield after the show. Garfield say, you know what? I think I want to adopt Judaism. What would you say to that individual?
I would say Judaism has a rich tradition. I would say that when I first started studying this project, it was pretty much an academic project about race and, oh, here are these interesting black folks who say they're Jews. But then as I learned more and more about Judaism, I became quite interested in the philosophy that's embedded in Judaism, talking about tikkun olam and the way in which ethics are interpreted within the Jewish context. And so I think it actually has a lot to offer. And it makes me realize, it probably offers some of the same things that Black Americans were drawn to with Islam, in that it provides a way of life. It provides rules and a law for behavior, right? It's all neat and clean. And
Mm.
so if one is looking for a sense of moral direction, I think Judaism has a rich tradition to offer.
Yeah.
That would be my response
Before
to
we go any further, let me
you. That would not be the response you expected, does it?
no, I mean it's not even that. I think personally Judaism is actually a good religion to actually look into. And what I mean, I support everybody's religion if it entails how you look at your moral compass and so forth. I don't
Exactly.
bash anybody for that. But when you're trying to say you're better than somebody because of this perspective or that, I have a serious problem with that.
Well, and that's exactly,
So
and I think all of the world religions offer that
you're
that
better.
positive side, to moral life.
Right, definitely. If somebody want to be a Buddhist or follow Hinduism or Shintoism or Confucianism, that's their business, you know.
That's
So
right. And we have the Jew boos out there too, right? The Jewish Buddhists running around. So it's
So this is Dr. Haynes' book, family, The Soul of Judaism, Jews of African Descent in America. If you're not interested if you don't want to know the history of Black Judaism and its roots, don't buy the book. But if you're really interested in the subject, I'm telling you, it's actually, I have it on my phone. It's actually on my computer. I have it on both places. It's on my Kindle, on my phone, and I actually have it also here. So at the end of the day, ladies and gentlemen, I'm telling you, this book is a great read. I've used it as sources, and it's full of sources. Full of sources. We have, I think, Jonathan Short is going to come up sometime next month, so he's gonna add on to some of the stuff that you said today. But ladies and gentlemen, I urge you to get this book. It's a great read. Before we end the interview, um, you said you had some articles coming up. Do you plan to write a part two to this, or what are you doing?
well, no, part two. No, but I think I want to look at the history of racism and anti-Semitism and their connection, and look at the way conversations about the two groups have been intertwined. Um, because to me, it's fascinating that in an era where George Floyd is murdered and Jews are murdered in unprecedented numbers in synagogues. Meanwhile, we don't make a connection. We
Mm-hmm.
don't we don't we see them as isolated events as opposed to some understanding of why these things are happening during the same time. And
Right.
it's in that relationship to the construction of difference and whiteness that I believe is so important, because it's the construction of whiteness that's at the center of the construction of difference for Jews and blacks.
Right. What role? See that you brought that up. You did point out in your book the role that the interpretation, or I should say, the misinterpretation of Ham has caused for centuries for people who were quote unquote black in the African continent and carrying over that tradition of we are cursed and so forth. Do you want to elaborate on that a little bit? Because since you're gonna write a book about racism and anti-Semitism, what role do you think the falsehood of the Hamitic curse caused for us as blacks?
Oh, the Ham curse is significant. The whole Hamitic narrative is really significant in shaping the 20th century. But it's sort of the popular narratives about blacks and race are multi-layered. So
Mm-hmm.
we have the Ham myth, we have minstrel shows, we have criminalization through the criminal justice system, right? So there are a number of layers to the construction of black difference.
Mm-hmm.
Maybe I think that's the easiest way to sort of answer it, not without getting into a long, drawn out,
Right.
academic sounding conversation. Um, but yeah, I think we often want to reduce race to identity and not deal with the fact that race at its basis is about denying people things, whether it be resources, economic viability, political membership, right? So the construction of race and difference And then that quickly gets linked up to the way in which we determine who's going to be a citizen and who's not, who's going to count as real and who's not. And so the more I've studied race, the more I've come to believe that race is an important part of the construction of nations. And so what keeps race alive is, in fact, that national identities they're embedded in racial constructions.
Right.
And so it's not just race as this free floating thing just stuck on people's bodies and in their heads. Race is a real political reality that's embedded in the way we organize the world.
Right.
And so it's that material organization that we have to pay attention to.
I got a question before we leave. How does Dr. Haynes judge the truth or validity of oral claims made of heritage or tribal history?
That was the beauty of it. I didn't approach it from that question of what is your claim? Like, can I prove your claim? John Jackson says in his book, Thin Description, he basically says we can't evaluate the Israelites' claims. He says it's too complicated and messy, and he talks about kind of culture being all mushed together, and he has a term called brocolade or brocolade. I'm not sure how to pronounce it. Mm-hmm. I, on the other hand, took a different tact. I didn't say we can't know, but we may not be able to know in any particular case. So I can't necessarily, if you say, look, granddaddy said, grandma was a Jew or granddaddy was a Jew, and now, you're an Israelite and we're going to practice this. There's no way of assessing that past, right? No more than stories passed on within families, like those are family folklore. We can't really evaluate that. And I think the notion that should be the basis on which we judge people, I think that's the falsehood. As a scholar, my approach was simply to say, why do you, as a person that I perceive as Black, say you're Black and also say you're Jewish? Like, why? What do you get out of that? What's to be gained? And that my presumption is people are not crazy. There was something to be gained by it. Mm-hmm. And in the analysis, I kind of argued that there was something to be gained, not only a rejection of a Negro identity and a claim to an identity that has value, but also the potential for both material and symbolic resources that came along with those identities that sort of were denied, quote, the Negro. And I think so it's in that vein that I see what they're doing as a legitimate struggle within within the racial constraints of the society in which they live. Rather than saying they left slavery and reinvented themselves as Jews, I see that they are constructing meaning and for their lives just like everybody else is.
Wow, beautiful. I'm going to leave it there, but before I go, ladies and gentlemen, again, let me remind everyone that you have to purchase this book to be a subscriber to my channel. This is a must read. I'm going to say it again. If you're not interested in our history, because this is a part of our history, whether we want to be a Jew or not, this is a essential part of our history that's left out. Whether it's because of conversions or whatever reason, Luso-Africans having babies and so forth, it doesn't matter. This is a part of our history, and it's a part of our rich history. It's a part of the Harlem's history. Wentworth, Ford, all them guys in Harlem, the Ethiopian Hebrew Israelite group. It's a part of our history. All right. What do you want to leave us with before we go? As far as
thanks. First, let me just say thank you, Brother Garfield, for having me on again. I always enjoy our conversations. I'll leave you with these words from Rabbi Tate, who was Israelite rabbi who I met, and I didn't realize it was rather shortly before he passed away. And when we had our conversations, there was a moment where I felt he was deciding whether or not he was going to trust me, whether or not he was going to tell me what he really felt.
Mm.
And he kind of said to me, we're on a journey. He says, my grandchildren, they speak Hebrew and they know this and then, and I didn't know that when I was a child, but I'm on this trajectory with my family and we're sort of on the road of returning. And this is when the whole idea of the revert made sense to me in the way he was describing that it wasn't a rejection of rabbinic Judaism, but he had to come back on his own terms given the racist society that he was engaged with. And that to me was just a fascinating interview. And I felt honored that he was sharing his life story with me.
Wow.
I hope I did justice to it in the book.
All right, ladies and gentlemen, again, this is Dr. Bruce Haynes. The Soul of Judaism, African Descent in America. Jewish African Descent in America. All right. So
Thanks again, Brother Garfield. It's been a real pleasure.
Peace and love, brother. I appreciate you coming on. Thank you so much. Really appreciate it. So, ladies and gentlemen, thank you guys for tuning in. I hope you guys enjoy the information. And I hope you tune in tomorrow. I have Dr. Richard Carrier. He's going to be on tomorrow. We're going to discuss the conversation with him and Jabari and Jabari's response and setting up a debate between him and Jabari. All right. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen. I'm out. Peace.